The scent of sea salt fills the air as a young boy sets out to the beach to complete his work for the day. His job revolves around collecting seashells. He lives on the ancient coast of Peru, more than 500 years ago, in a small fishing village that thrived from the ocean's abundance. As his bare feet sink into the thick sand, he stumbles upon something strange, a smooth, triangular stone, as large as his hand. The boy doesn't yet realize it, but this triangular stone is a fossil from 13 million years ago, belonging to one of the largest marine predators to have ever lived. A shark, with a mouth as wide as a man's wingspan. Mixed into a productive sea of familiar fish, more than 10 million years ago, were truly spectacular creatures that seem like myths uttered from the boastful mouths of sailors. Some were giant, vicious, or bizarre, but all vanished from our world. Together, along the coast of South America, they formed an ecosystem like no other. Legendary in proportion. The Sea of Monsters, including the almighty Megalodon. The proper uncovering of this hidden world started some 3 centuries after the fall of the Inca. In the middle of the 1800s, the Italian immigrant Antonio Raimondi would set foot in the country of Peru. An enthusiastic naturalist and geographer, he was the first to notice that fossils were hidden among the rocks of Peru. Specifically, fossil whales, which decades later in the 1900s was shipped to the United States. It was in the 1970s that the attention to these Peruvian rocks, known as the Pisco Formation, boomed exponentially. The energy and excitement all centered around one thing. The Pisco was not just an ordinary fossil formation. It's a special kind of formation that, no matter where they're found, attract paleontologists like moths to a flame. The Pisco is what paleontologists call a Lagerstätte. Lagerstätte, unexcitedly translated to storage place in German, is the ultimate holy grail of fossil sites. They are designated as such if the sites preserve a myriad of extraordinary fossils in a state of excellent preservation. Setting aside the pure spectacle, Lagerstatten are so valuable because they provide a unique picture at unparalleled resolution into the paleontological record. These snapshots into the prehistoric past, which so often lies obscured and unsolved, are beyond essential for understanding the history of our amazing planet. How the sediments of a Lagerstätte are preserved with such superior quality to other fossil sites is fascinating, if not enigmatic. Take, for instance, the Pisco Formation, a sediment deposit consisting of sandstones and shales. The Pisco Basin was hoisted out of the shallow ocean bed and onto dry land by plate tectonics. Hundreds of meters thick, it is not fully known why the sediment of the Pisco preserves marine life in such exquisite detail as it does. There are theories, of course. Cycles of oxygen depletion at the ocean floor, known as anoxia, might have flushed scavengers away from the seabed, allowing corpses to rest peacefully without disturbance. Or low oxygen levels could have chemically assisted in rapid mineralization, allowing these carcasses to fossilize more easily. Another hypothesis is that the large bodies of these marine creatures allowed for a process called scouring, in which their large bodies fall fast enough to the sea floor to disperse sediments, partially burying the remains when the dust settled. The Lagerstatten might be blamed not on how the animals died, but the way they lived. It's been theorized that the Pisco Formation, with its calm shallows, was the nursery ground for young sharks, rays, and whales, leading to their particular abundance in the fossil record. The truth is probably that several of these reasons acted in unison to create a site as fossiliferous as the Pisco. Putting aside the direct cause, the fruits of the fossilization process are laid bare in the Peruvian rock. Countless skeletons of marine vertebrates, nearly complete and articulated, can be found in the Pisco. Some are so well preserved that their last meals have too been fossilized in their abdomens. The hair-like baleen, located in whales, a very difficult substance to fossilize, can be found in a relatively unprecedented abundance in the Pisco fossil records. It's finds like those that make the Pisco Formation such a wonderfully illuminating view into the prehistoric waters. The snapshot that the Pisco Formation provides is particularly significant and complex. You see, a solid amount of the species found at this formation are not confined to its shales and sandstones. Indeed, many of these animals were in fact world travelers, with less spectacular fossils being found all across the world. This is of course due to the nature of the ocean. Because of this, the Pisco can in some ways be looked at as a microcosm of the whole world's equatorial oceans, with a time period from around 13 million years ago to 6 million years ago. But in other ways, this geology preserves an ecosystem that is exclusive to the South American coastline. Some of the forces acting on the continent's Pacific shores were unique only to it, and can still be found today in contemporary times. As well, the Pisco is a dynamic geologic setting, over the course of its 7 million years history. It preserves a seascape that changes quite drastically. Because of this, it is important to understand the global and regional powers at play during this ancient time. The chronology of the Pisco Formation spans 2 units of Earth's geologic history, known as epochs. The epochs in question are the Miocene and the Pliocene. It's easier to think of these 2 epochs as transitionary periods in Earth's history, representing a slow evolution of atmospheric CO2 decreasing and temperatures sinking. They are sandwiched in between the scorching hot times of the earlier Cenozoic era and the glacier-dominated ice ages of the Pleistocene epoch. In fact, the earliest geologic deposits we find in the Pisco are in the wake of what's known as the Miocene climate optimum, the last surge of an especially warm climate until the world plunged gradually into the colder times of the Pleistocene and today. But despite being seen as transitory, these 2 epochs were far from boring. On land, a novel and efficient plant known as grass spread across the continents in great plains, whilst groups of mammals like elephants and apes would evolve and prosper. It was the Miocene that our ancestors split from those of the chimpanzees. The continents had assumed nearly their current forms, and in the midst of the Pliocene, South and North America had collided with each other at the Isthmus of Panama. But the oceans underwent just as much change. Most of the time, what underlies massive change is the altering of the most unseen individuals. In our case, what seems to have influenced the Miocene oceans are microscopic organisms known as diatoms. Diatoms are plankton, specifically microalgae, undergoing photosynthesis in unfathomable numbers across the world's oceans. As the global oceans cooled gradually in the Miocene epoch, the diversity of these diatoms increased substantially. Although small, the number of other ocean organisms that in some form rely on the multitudes of these little diatoms is monstrous. Therefore, when these microscopic plankton experienced a boom, the rest of the ocean did as well. This boom climbed itself all the way to the top, to the ocean's very largest residents. Earlier, in the Cenozoic, an ancient lineage of land mammals trotted their way into the shallow waters. Millions of years later, they had evolved into blubbery ocean-going giants known as whales. And it was porpoises that appeared to have benefited from the microscopic success of diatoms. In the latter parts of the Miocene, both toothed whales, which includes dolphins, and those with baleen, experienced a jump in diversity. With the success of porpoises, the Cenozoic oceans would begin to slowly transform into the waters we know today. But something especially superb was happening in the southern oceans. Specific to our story, in the waters of South America's western coast. Starting in an earlier epoch, this stretch of water had begun experiencing a phenomenon that transformed its ecosystem forever. Along the shorelines loomed over by the great Andes Mountains, the winds blow the warm surface water northward, which is known as the Humboldt Current. To restore balance, the vacuum of surface water needs to be filled, allowing deep, cold ocean waters to rise up from below. This continuous process is called upwelling, and it has unintended effects on the life of the coast. When warm ocean waters depleted of nutrients are replaced by the Humboldt Current, the deep waters carry a brand new reservoir of microscopic nutrition, which supplies numbers of those ever-important diatoms. Moving up the food chain, this revitalization of nutrients creates a boom in fish population and sparks unthinkable biological productivity. The upwelling is able to sustain, in present days, swarms of anchovies, mackerels, and sardines, as well as the multitudes of animals who feed on those schooling fish, including us humans. Indeed, the seas off the coast of Peru represent less than 0.1% of the world's ocean surface. However, at the current moment, they produce about 10% of the world's fish catch. Such incredible biological output is only possible due to the circumstances of the Humboldt Current, which began millions of years ago, and the productivity of the region was probably just as outstanding as it is today. Indeed, it is very possible that the schools of sardines that feed modern mouths were the very same ones that made up the diets of the Pisco Formation's beasts. The Pisco Formation preserves an astounding 7 million years of marine prehistory. Although fundamental aspects of the environment, like the Humboldt Current, remained present throughout this time, other aspects of the ecosystem changed across these millions of years. In the earliest chunks of the Pisco's record, the fossils of the ancient shark Hemipristis cera are abundant. Now extinct, this shark's close relative is the still-alive snaggletooth shark, an obscure animal that prefers to swim in deeper waters of tropical coastlines. From this connection, scientists have deduced that this earliest era of the Pisco Formation was a shallow subtropical sea. As discussed before, there might have been anoxic conditions on the seabed in intervals, but this surface was oxygen-rich enough for the survival of numerous hard-shelled organisms to show up in the fossil record. Preserved alongside them were their predators, eagle rays and the shell-crunching teeth of fish, can be found within the prehistoric sands and silts. For reptiles, sea turtles and marine crocodiles swam in the shallow tides as well. Prehistoric seabirds roosted on salt-soaked perches. Although the ecosystem indicates shallow water, there are still signs it was connected to a deep ocean habitat. Baleen whale skeletons and the teeth of thresher sharks are both discovered in this strata, both indicative of a connection to the pelagic or open part of the Pacific Ocean. Swimming alongside them were the toothed whales, both dolphins and a family of toothed whales represented in modern times by the iconic sperm whale. The next layer of the Pisco Formation preserves an environment similar to the first, but with some slight changes. The ocean was still shallow, but the upwelling supported by the Humboldt Current was more obvious. A diatomaceous layer is preserved in the upper section. Many of the same animals found in the first layer are found here. However, whale remains are abundant in number and diversity. Of the baleen variety are two dominant groups. One is a subsection known as rorquals, which still persists today as the dominant faction of baleen whales. Currently, their numbers include the largest animal that has ever lived, the blue whale. Ranging the Pisco oceans with them were the Cetiotheriids, a group of nearly extinct baleen whales, in modern times only represented by the pygmy right whales. Cetiotheriids were small, but only for whale standards. For example, pygmy right whales measure about 6 meters and 3.5 metric tons. Flying above the waves were birds, but they were not the same prehistoric lineages from earlier in the Miocene. Instead, these seabirds were of modern genera, cormorants and booby birds. The most recent of the Pisco Formation's deposits preserve a pelagic environment, where open oceans persist, washing over a reef on the seabed. Marine mammals like whales and dolphins continue to be found excellently preserved. But another environment present in this final chapter of the Pisco was one closer to the ocean shore, evidenced by the fossils of near-coast fauna. For instance, it is during this time that we find the emergence of some of the most charismatic marine mammals, pinnipeds, which includes seals and sea lions. Another cute addition to the ocean was penguins, who waddled across the rocky outcrops of the Pisco. However, such coastal fossils are rare, indicating that the pelagic oceans dominated at this time. Huge schools of sardines would have fed endless pods of whales. But unlike our time, at least some species of whale were not invulnerable. There were monsters feeding on these huge marine giants. Indeed, it is these undersea terrors that separate the time of the Pisco from ours. And no monster is more infamous and more iconic than one. It might have been the largest ocean predator of all time, the monarch of the Pisco, Otodus Megalodon. Megalodon was first described in the middle of the 19th century by the natural historian Louis Agassiz, a name aptly meaning big tooth. It is these giant teeth that are the primary evidence we have of these creatures, approaching 18 centimeters long in some. These teeth have been found across the globe, from Japan and Australia, across Western Europe, to both coasts of the United States, and, of course, South America. For centuries before it was scientifically described, historic peoples have collected these teeth. Although they're not always known as such, the Roman scholar Pliny the Elder famously thought these fossils resembled petrified human tongues. Glossopetrae, Latin for tongue stones, resurfaced in medieval times as a supernatural cure for poisons. In the New World, the fossils were used for various reasons by a myriad of peoples. Native Americans found use in these glossy serrated stones, from knives and scrapers to jewelry, and even ornaments with some kind of religious connotation. The teeth were found as far inland as Ohio, suggesting that indigenous Americans had traded these relics with each other. The value is clear. Megalodon fossil teeth are rather brilliant to behold. And such large teeth suggest a truly monstrous body. Ever since the 15th century, when it was first hypothesized the fossils could belong to a shark of some kind, the Megalodon has been compared to the modern terror of the oceans, the great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias. On a purely superficial level, the teeth of the Megalodon do indeed resemble those of the great white, albeit on a much larger scale. Therefore, the Megalodon has been famously lumped in with the genus Carcharodon, and has commonly been portrayed as an oversized great white in popular culture. Even in the scientific community, there has been little to discern the two sharks. Besides teeth, it was reasoned Megalodon must have resembled the great white shark due to lifestyle similarities. The living Carcharodon is an endotherm, meaning it produces heat internally to sustain an active lifestyle, as opposed to more sluggish shark species. The giant Megalodon must have been an active predator, and therefore must have needed a body plan promoting endothermy, like those of the great white shark and its relatives. Thus, the size estimations of Megalodon have usually been, in some fashion, from scaling up the body of a great white. For instance, one paper modelling off the proportions of a great white shark estimates Megalodon is an animal growing up to 16 meters, about 4 meters longer than a bus. It tipped the scales at 60 metric tons, larger than some of the whales of today. A massive mouth could open more than a meter from the top to the bottom tooth, and extend 1.7 meters in width. These jaws could have delivered a bite force unparalleled in the animal kingdom, crushing its prey with the force of 10 metric tons or more than 10 times the force of a great white. Judging from the speed of modern predatory sharks, the Megalodon would have travelled the seas at a relatively fast cruising speed, about 1.4 meters per second. To sustain its giant girth and active lifestyle, the Megalodon would have to consume on average 32 kilograms of flesh every day. Coined a super predator, the Megalodon might have been one of the largest and most menacing animals to ever live. However, these specific measurements might not be accurate. Firstly, this was operating on the assumption that Carcharodon Megalodon even belonged in that genus. The similarities between the teeth of Megalodon and the great white sharks are indeed similar, but don't seem to be directly related to each other. Instead, they seem to be products of the phenomenon of convergent evolution, where two unrelated animals evolve a similar trait. In the shark's case, to specialize in a specific predatory lifestyle. So, although the shape of the two species' teeth is quite similar, analyzing the Megalodon tooth further reveals incredibly fine serrations. These are absent from the great white, suggesting they are not as closely related as once thought. Megalodon might have diverged from the now extinct genus of Otodus. Otodus megalodon, as it's now known, was not only distantly related to great whites, but might not have looked like it much either. The assumption that this animal must have resembled a great white shark due to its endothermic requirements has now been debunked. The so-called sluggish sharks might not be so sluggish. For instance, the giant, peaceful basking shark was revealed to be an endotherm itself, severing another connection Megalodons possessed with Carcharodon. Indeed, the thought process that Megalodon must have been an active predator due to its resemblance to great whites, and therefore needed an endothermic body plan akin to great whites, is a case of circular reasoning. And due to its immense mass, the Megalodon almost definitely did not especially resemble its close relative, the mako, a streamlined, quick-moving predator many magnitudes smaller. Thus, this vacuum in any obvious body plans opens up many possibilities about the hypothetical shape of Megalodon, which might look like nothing that swims the ocean nowadays. In one case, a recent study suggests Otodus megalodon had a more elongated body plan than was previously suggested. A slimmer build might not have increased the total mass of the animal more than previously estimated, but it would make Megalodon even longer than expected. Megalodon's endothermy and activity level have been put under question as well. The new study also suggests that they were nowhere near the fast cruisers of other predator sharks, and instead operated at a much more subdued pace. Indeed, how exactly the endothermy of Megalodon may have worked was put into question as well. It is hypothesized that these animals, like the basking shark, were something called regionally endothermic, and only certain organs in their bodies produced internal heat. For the Megalodon, this energy might not have been used for moving quickly, but instead needed to be supplied to their extended intestinal tract that snaked across the length of the beast. Within the walls of its gut, chunks of meat slowly being broken down would require a great deal of energy to be properly digested and absorbed by the animal. Therefore, it's unlikely Megalodon was a marathon swimmer, but its lifestyle might not have called for that. Numerous scratch marks have been found on the bones of marine mammals from the time, from sperm whales to the prehistoric cetotherids and the adorable pinnipeds. Thus, we can infer Megalodon had a dietary specialization in small to medium-sized marine mammals. Even for a massive shark, there is space to hide in the ocean. With the proper camouflage, maybe this ocean terror could have ambushed its prey from a short distance, ripping into their flesh with rows of massive teeth. The truth is that despite how popular Megalodon is, we know very little about it compared to other prehistoric celebrities, like Tyrannosaurus rex or woolly mammoths. Even though scientists have inferred some things, its exact body shape, size, and lifestyle is up in the air. This is because despite some scientific fossils like the teeth being widespread, the rest of the animal is largely unknown. Unlike us, the skeletons of megalodons, sharks, and their closest relatives are composed of a substance called cartilage. We too have cartilage. It's a tissue that can be found in the structures of our ears and nose, and in between our joints. It's more flexible than bone, but unfortunately, due to its chemical structure, does not fossilize anywhere near as easily as our dense bones. Therefore, the skeletons of sharks, including megalodons, are regularly left out of the fossil record, save for their teeth. It is for this reason that we lack much evidence about Otodus megalodon. However, by some minor miracles, the other cartilaginous components of a megalodon skeleton have been preserved and described by paleontologists. One of these is a set of vertebrae found in Belgium, which helped put together the hypothetical size of this creature. Another set of fossils comes from Japan, which included vertebrae and, outstandingly, scales. These scales were one of the components that helped scientists identify Otodus megalodon as more closely related to mako sharks than to great whites. Outside of these two examples, fossils of megalodons outside of teeth remain exceedingly rare. A more measured and accurate description of this shark's size, ecology, and evolutionary lineage is almost certainly dependent on more miraculous fossils like these being uncovered. So, for now, we will have to bide our time to uncover the mystery of the terrifying mega-toothed shark. It is very possible the next breakthrough fossils of Megalodon might come from the Lagerstatten fossil beds of the Pisco Formation. Megalodon was not the only shark that swam the oceans around Peru. As discussed before, several ancestors to modern taxa, like an ancient snaggletooth shark, are found in these sediments. Distributed among the Pisco's three eras were regimes of familiar fish, including the copper sharks, sawfish, shortfin makos, bull, and tiger sharks, and various forms of rays. Nearing the top of the food chain to accompany the megalodon were yet more giant extinct sharks. An ancient species of great white swam the Pisco at these times, known as Hubble's white shark. This shark was, in evolutionary terms, a transitionary species between the modern great white and another prehistoric monster, the giant mako, Cosmopolitodus. Seemingly a very successful creature. As its name suggests, Cosmopolitodus fossils have been found distributed across the globe. As well, the shark grew massive, and in the upper range reached a length longer than the very largest great whites of our times. Despite its obscurity in the media, we know a surprising amount of information about the giant mako's ecology. One juvenile specimen from the Pisco was found preserved with the remnants of fish in its torso, suggesting quite clearly adolescents may have fed on fish. Like other large sharks, however, the adults seem to have preferred marine mammals. From a dolphin skeleton in Pliocene, Italy, we find evidence of how the giant mako hunted. It appears that, like the modern white shark, Cosmopolitodus attacked from the bottom, lunging at a mammal's vulnerable underbelly and eviscerating the poor prey. But sharks were not the only predators of this ocean. The radiation of whales allowed for the success of many different porpoise types, besides the iconic baleen filter feeders. One group swimming in the Pisco Formation was the beaked whales. Some of the most enigmatic groups of mammals yet known, the beaked whales resemble at first oversized dolphins. Despite being related to these toothed whales, these odd animals lack teeth save for a pair of tusks possessed by males. Instead of a lifestyle dependent on teeth, the beaked whales dive deep underwater to depths most other marine mammals cannot persist. Here, they hoover up squid and other prey into their mouths like a black hole. There is very little information to work with. However, it is proposed the more primitive beaked whales of the Pisco Formation were more suited to shallower ocean water. Such a theory is demonstrated in the fossil record by beaked whale remains preserved alongside surface-loving sardines that it had ingested. Other whales evolved in the oceans as well, this time with teeth. Although not quite the size of whales, dolphins seem to have been rather successful in this environment. The very first fossil vertebrate described from the whole formation was that of a dolphin, Incacetus, named after the mighty empire that once ruled Peru. Another common dolphin species was Brachydelphis, which is interesting in the fact that its closest living relatives are not ocean dolphins at all, but instead a river dolphin species, now secluded in the coasts of eastern South America, opposite of Peru. But for the larger predatory whales, we must look at one group in particular, the toothed whale family, Physeteridae. Today, the largest predator setting aside filter feeders is not a shark or reptile, but the largest living member of Physeteridae, the sperm whale, which travel unfathomable leagues into the ocean abyss to wrestle the kraken-esque giant squid. The reputation of these giant hunters was well represented in the Pisco as well. The most diminutive taxa were the pygmy sperm whale, a forgotten animal that still lives on today, picking off numbers of small squid in the shallower parts of the ocean. Moving up a size was the Acrophyseter, who cut mollusks from their diet to feed on fish, birds, and other marine mammals. The wolves of the Pisco, these 4-meter-long menaces were not as large as other predators of the Pisco, but were sure to have frightened the seals and small whales they would have called prey. But there is a predator larger than this one. So much larger that it rivals, in fact, Megalodon for the ruler of the Pisco. It is the terrifying Livyatan melville, with a genus name from the Hebrew word for the biblical terror of the ocean, and the species name a reference to Herman Melville, and his book about a killer sperm whale. Livyatan melville lived up to its title. It was a literal leviathan in this sea of monsters. Despite the name Big Tooth, Megalodon ironically does not hold the title for the largest biting teeth of any animal. Instead, this distinction goes to Livyatan, whose massive plantain-shaped teeth grew about 36 centimeters in length, longer than most people's forearms. Unlike modern sperm whales, who only possess a row of teeth in their lower jaw to assist in eating soft-bodied prey, Livyatan had massive teeth set in both the top and bottom of the mouth, suggesting it fed on the flesh of other vertebrates. These teeth were propelled by massive jaws, and although they might not have overcome Megalodon in pure bite force, Livyatan still probably holds the record among all land vertebrates and their descendants for bite power, from T-Rex to hyenas to crocodiles. This powerful head was positioned on a humongous body, which hovered somewhere around 15 meters in length, approaching the size of a bull sperm whale. Of course, there's a possibility some grew much larger than even that. Their huge size and weaponry allowed the Livyatan to be yet another apex predator of the Pisco Formation. Similarly to Megalodon, Livyatan would have subsisted on medium-sized whales, particularly the prehistoric cetotherids. Using its rows of giant teeth, Livyatan would overpower its prey and tear whole chunks of flesh from the animal's body to dispose of the unfortunate victim. But like its rival, little is known of Livyatan. It was only described about a decade ago, and the fossil record of this giant killer remains spotty. The very first discovery of this animal comes from the Pisco Formation, where its massive skull was dug up from the sediments. And just like Megalodon, the whale's huge fossilized teeth show off a cosmopolitan distribution. They have been dug up from Australia and Africa in the southern hemisphere, all the way up to California. But that's nearly it for the evidence of Livyatan. Despite this, the evidence we do have for the animal obviously supports a massive, globally diverse apex predator of other large marine mammals. It is that position in the food web that would have put it into confrontation with other large apex predators. And due to its fossils popping up in places like the Pisco, we know it was in the right place at the right time to interact with Otodus Megalodon. And since they were going after the same prey, there would have surely been some violent competition for food amongst these two behemoths. Outright carnage might have been rare. Common sense and observations from today show us that large predators rarely, if ever, fight to death over food. It's just not rational to end up mortally wounded after every interaction with a rival. Still, paleontologists have been captivated by how these two super predators may have interacted, and may have shaped the ecosystem around them. An obvious question is about sustainability. In our modern oceans, aside from invertebrate hunting whales, the apex predator of the ocean is the orca, which at about 6 meters and 6 metric tons is definitely a daunting animal. However, the two giant killers of the Miocene and Pliocene were magnitudes larger, with the capacity to hunt orca-sized prey. Just how is it that the ocean could have sustained not one, but 2 species of these massive predators? To review an earlier point, the oceans were particularly productive at these times. This especially assisted the diversity of small to medium-sized whales that Megalodon and Livyatan preferred. As well as having an abundant population, an individual baleen whale presents a special quality that makes it especially good prey for larger predators. Whales are covered in blubber, a thick layer of fat for sustaining the animal's own energy needs, as well as insulating it from the cold water. Such nutritious blubber meant an individual whale was packed with calories, enough to comfortably sustain any predator who was able to hunt the whales, like Livyatan or Megalodon. Under these specific conditions, a duo of giant hunters could have survived at the same time. These two ocean overlords also had their own particular impact on the ecosystem, as do all apex predators. Looking at the toothed whales today, orcas and sperm whales can live for as long as we humans do, with lifespans over 65 years of age. But in comparison, research has revealed the whales of the Pisco had died from old age by around the age of 20. Furthermore, these whales reached maturity very fast, rapidly growing in their early years. This pattern in life cycles is explained by the ecological pressure of Megalodon and Livyatan. In zoology, it's common that species that experience pressure from predation adopt a live young, die fast means of existence. That is, they grow to maturity as quickly as they can and breed as much as possible in that short period. This is because their lives will almost inevitably be cut short by predation. Of course, animals that experience no natural predators, like orcas, don't have these pressures and can evolve to age slowly and live out an extended lifespan. But the fact that an orca-sized animal experienced these predation stresses in the Miocene shows how alarmingly impactful Livyatan and Megalodon were as kings of the ocean. Their experience shaped the oceans of the Pisco Formation into something completely removed from the waters of today. Of course, Megalodon and Livyatan were not the only outlandish marine life at this point in time. The Pisco is chock full with plenty of bizarre creatures. Take, for instance, this odd animal, Odobenocetops. It is yet another porpoise, distantly related to beluga whales and narwhals, which it is of similar size to. Like narwhals, it possesses tusks, but evolutionarily unrelated to those of the narwhal. In the female, these were a pair of symmetrical tusks parallel to the body, but in male specimens, the tusk, singular, is larger. You heard it right, only the right tusk is longer, a needle-like object, more than a meter in length. This, along with the skull bones on the right being more developed, makes Odobenocetops the only mammal with such obvious external asymmetry. What the tusks may have been used for is quite perplexing, but there is a hypothesis. The tusks were far too thin and fragile to be used for any combat or digging. Instead, both sexes may have used the tusks to orient themselves to be parallel with the seabed, similar to runners on a sled. Meanwhile, the males might have sacrificed some of this orientation for display, possibly to attract mates or assert dominance. Odobenocetops are weird in other ways. Unlike other porpoises, they have a highly reduced melon, the organ sitting on the end of the skull that assists in echolocation. In one species, the melon is nearly completely gone and would have been useless in echolocation. Instead, Odobenocetops seem to have favoured stronger eyesight, which was positioned in the form of forward-facing binocular vision. Instead of narrow beaks, a broad muzzle was capped with muscular lips. It is theorized Odobenocetops was a benthic feeder, foraging on the ocean floor with its eyes and lips, and when crustaceans or mollusks were discovered, siphoning them up using its tongue and palate. This lifestyle and feeding strategy is very similar to another tusk marine mammal, the walrus. Indeed, even the tusks might be used in precisely the same way as the walruses, for orientation and social display. But once more, they are not related. It's just one of the most striking examples of convergent evolution in the fossil record. Marine mammals and fish were not the only groups swimming in the Pisco seas. Although their era had passed, reptiles were abundant. Sea turtles gracefully soared in the waters. But maybe more surprising are the crocodiles that inhabited the Pisco as well. Found in every age of the formation, these saltwater-adapted crocodilians were a staple of the Pisco environment. And some got very large and rather bizarre. One species is the Saurcacasuchus. At nearly 4 meters long, it does not look like your average crocodile or alligator. It is instead a gavialid, a bizarre reptile still found today in Asia. With an incredibly narrow snout and a bulbous muzzle, these are specialized fish eaters. And the saltwater Saurcacasuchus was probably no different. But it was dwarfed by another massive marine reptilian. Twice as large was the Pisco gavialis, a giant gavialid whose intact skull was found in the Pisco Formation. The abundant fish and warm, shallow waters favoured these saltwater reptiles, allowing them to be as successful and large as they were. Of course, as semi-aquatic animals, a shallow sea was a necessary environment, allowing them to access nearby shorelines. The coasts and rocky outcrops of the Pisco Formation were filled with an odd assortment of animals basking in the tropical heat. Aside from the giant crocodiles, great colonies of penguins and seals would have inhabited the coasts. Just one of these seal species was Acrophoca, an early relative of the predatory leopard seals. Less adapted than modern seals for an aquatic life, it must have spent significant time resting on dry land. A more land-loving mammal was Q-Anosua, a dog-sized relative of the raccoon. Just as opportunistic as its modern cousin, Q-Anosua was adaptable enough to be one of the first North American animals to migrate to South America when the two continents neared each other, being able to carve a niche for itself on the sandy shores of Peru. The Pisco Lagerstatten is one of the most valuable places in the world for studying seabird evolution and diversity. Without a doubt, the skies of prehistoric Peru would have been constantly dotted with the flapping wings of the birds. The skies filled with their constant squawking. As discussed earlier, the youngest deposits of the Pisco Formation were marked by more modern lineages of seabirds, taking over the sulids, a family containing cormorants and booby birds. Already well established by the time of the Miocene epoch, these birds seem to have hit their peak in diversity sometime in the Pisco Formation's history. Differing in size and beak shapes, the different species of sulid appeared to have been driven by the same diversifying force that allowed so many other animal lineages to bloom during the time. That force being the abundance of ocean productivity caused by the current upwelling system. But before the sulids, in the earliest branches of the Pisco, were more ancient groups of seabirds, the pelagornithids. Now all extinct, they were truly prehistoric-looking animals, their most characteristic trait being a heavy beak filled with jagged serrations that mimicked teeth. These would have been perfect for catching and holding slippery prey from the ocean. What's more, they were some of the largest flying birds in the history of the Earth, with wingspans nearing 6 meters, as long as a small biplane. These giant wings would have allowed them to live effortlessly, soaring above an endless area of ocean, searching for food. But of the coastal fauna, none a stranger than this. Found only in the Pisco Formation's rocks is Thalassocnus, the sea sloth. By this time in South America's prehistory, the strange mammals endemic to the continent had evolved into a broad array of forms. This includes the sloths, who, along with their tree-hugging forms, had evolved into giant behemoths restricted to dry land. And in the case of Thalassocnus, we find in the fossil record a gradual shift to a more aquatic lifestyle on the Peruvian coast. The forelimbs of the sea sloth were still usable on land, but had certain adaptations for paddling as well as walking on the sea bottom, due to their negative buoyancy, similar to hippopotamus. Their broad mouths got more splayed and spoon-shaped as the sea sloths evolved, growing thick, muscular lips. All adaptations for grazing under the waves on seaweeds and seagrass. The earliest sea sloths were presumably only feeding in the shallowest section of the tide, no more than 1 meter deep, foraging for seaweed brought up by the waves. But the more derived species of Thalassocnus could plunge to greater depths, grazing directly on the shallow meadows of seagrass that would have dotted the South American shallows. These youngest species seem to have been very successful at it, growing 3 meters long, larger than a man. But how did a sloth of all animals end up in the position to colonize the oceans? Well, the reason that Thalassocnus was even able to wade into the water to graze was maybe due to the absence of another group of mammals, sirenians. Sirenians are a group of mammals that include manatees and dugongs, peaceful grazers of undersea grasslands. They were present in the Pisco in earlier times, but by the arrival of the sea sloths they seem to have mysteriously disappeared. Such a vacuum in the ecosystem would have allowed for another herbivore to take its place, and the ground sloths might have been the perfect candidate. Even modern tree sloths seem to have an affinity for swimming, moving a great deal faster in the water than their sluggish pace on land. Thus, under the pressures of evolution, this most strangest of the Pisco's fauna would have come to be, capping off one of the most unique and incredible ecosystems planet Earth has ever seen. So then, if the ever-important Humboldt Current is still around today, why did so many of these wonderful animals disappear? Indeed, this constant is still with us in modern oceans, but many other aspects of this ecosystem have changed. Maybe most importantly, the climate. As explained before, in the Pliocene the cooling trend continued, ebbing and flowing in intensity, but eventually plunging the world into an ice age. Global cooling affects the world in many ways, but for the Pisco, this was a reduction in sea levels. As the ocean receded, the shallow coastal environments fractured and shrunk. They were not nearly as warm as they once were. The tropical forces that keep them warm were disappearing. The Humboldt Current's water was slowly being more influenced by the cold Antarctic current to the south. This temperature change especially affected the sea sloths, the cooling waters eliminating the seagrass meadows they relied on for grazing. The reduction and change of these warm coastal zones around the Pisco may have meant a disappearance of nurseries for the sharks and whales. It's the extinction of the more open ocean animals that is somewhat more complex. The small-bodied baleen whales, which peaked in diversity during the Miocene, slowly seemed to go extinct, barely holding on in the Pleistocene and Holocene. This appears to be due to the colder temperatures and constant changes in coastal environments, impacting these animals' ability to feed and care for their young. The superpredators, like Megalodon, would have obviously been affected by one of their prey items reducing in abundance. But there's no exact correlation. Megalodon goes extinct long before many of the smaller whale species do. Another factor that's been proposed is cold temperatures killing off these giant sharks. But Megalodon numbers don't seem to be affected by the temperature pulses of the Pliocene. What does seem to affect them is the appearance of other competitors. Although not as large, the proliferation of the modern great white shark and the orca whale, both efficient hunters of marine mammals, might have created a difficult environment for the Megalodon. Or more likely, the giant's adolescent offspring who were not full size. Like many extinctions, it was probably a combination of many factors. From the reduction of prey to competition to fragmentation in nursery and hunting environments. The only certainty is that, unlike some people like to say, the Megalodon is for sure extinct. Its giant teeth have been removed from the fossil record for millions of years. And as a giant predator sticking near the surface of the ocean, there is no possible way its species could be undiscovered by science in the modern day. The reason why the extinctions of the Megalodon, Livyatan, and other residents of the Pisco Formation are so complex is that the ocean as an ecosystem is an endless web of interconnected parts. How it interacts with itself is an ever-evolving science still being studied. But this interconnectedness makes the oceans especially vulnerable to dramatic shifts in the ecosystem. And such shifts have resumed in our modern times. Man-made climate change has influenced the ocean in a myriad of complicated ways that in the future will have unfathomable effects on the diversity of our oceans. But what is hurting the Humboldt Current ecosystem more directly, for now, is commercial fishing. Despite, or maybe because of its unprecedented abundance, the ocean surrounding the Humboldt Current has been remorselessly overfished by humans, leaving everything dependent on those populations at risk of being wiped out, with modern animals of the ocean joining the Megalodon in extinction. Hopefully, action will be taken to curb commercial fishing. The most any of us can do, if it's economically possible, is to quit using products that are directly stealing resources from our seas in unsustainable ways. It would be tragic if this final remnant of the Pisco Formation disappeared. Let this Peruvian water be a reminder for future generations of one of the most outstanding aquatic ecosystems this blue planet has ever produced.